It was 11:17 at night when Jonathan Hale walked out of the private gallery on Ellsworth Row and found the city quieter than he expected. Streetlights carved pale moons on wet pavement, and an ice-cold wind pushed paper confetti across a fountain plaza. He had a scarf tucked high against his neck, and the smell of old cologne clung to his coat. On the stone edge of the fountain, a small boy sat with his knees drawn up, shoulders shaking, a soaked jacket around him, and a torn paper boat clenched in his fist. He looked far too small for the marble steps he occupied, and far too alone for the middle of the night. "The Night Stalker scares me," the boy said, voice thin and raw, as if the sentence had been rehearsed until it broke. It landed in the air like a pebble thrown into glass. "If you were there by that fountain, what would you do? Would you keep walking and call someone later, or would you put the boy in your arms and not look back? Leave your answer in the comments." Jonathan did not walk on. He crouched, wrapped his coat around the child, and reached for his phone. That split-second decision was small in appearance and enormous in consequence. He carried the paper boat to the back seat of his car and placed it on the seat like a delicate relic. He told his driver to head to the nearest civic center and called Malik, his security lead. He told Malik to bring an extra blanket and not to draw attention. In the quiet of the car, the boy thumbed the edge of the boat and watched the raindrops grow into spider webs on the window. Jonathan tried to speak softly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ethan," came the reply. "Where are your parents?" Jonathan asked again. Ethan looked at the paper boat and then at the fountain light and said, "I told them, but he comes when they are asleep." It was a sentence that suggested more than grammar. A man with money and influence is supposed to know how to solve problems quickly, but in that moment, Jonathan felt something he had not expected, a feeling like an old wound opening. He steered toward a small shelter run by a foundation he had funded and began a night that would change lives. The rescue that followed was immediate and intimate. The shelter smelled of boiled coffee and disinfectant and had a sound of muffled television and hushed conversation in a room that held more kindness than space. Elena Morales, who ran intake, met them at the door. Her hands were rough from years of paperwork and soup ladles. She wrapped Ethan in a towel and listened to him speak in fragments. "He has a van with a black stripe," Ethan said between shivers. "He leaves a paper boat on the windowsill and whistles when the lights are off." Elena did not flinch. "You are safe now," she told him, and her voice was steady like a rope. The room held multiple sensory details: the groan of the old radiator, the faint chemical sting of bleach in the laundry room, a window with a cracked latch that let in a cold breath of night air, the metallic tick of a wall clock, and the soft cotton of the towel against the boy's skin. Malik stood at the doorway and watched, every muscle held in a pose he had learned when protecting people with money and not expecting to be asked to shelter a child. In the corner, a volunteer named Maria Lopez had a stack of children's books and a small leather teddy with one eye stitched back in place. That teddy would become a token in this story. The intake included quiet questioning and a simple photograph for an entry log. Elena filled fields with an organized hand and wrote, "Ethan Rivera, age 9, appears frightened, parent unknown, found Ellsworth Plaza, 23/11/17 at 23:30, and then looked up. We'll call the Division of Victim Services in the morning," she said. Ethan clutched the paper boat and did not look at the camera. There was an urgency in the air that asked for more than shelter. Jonathan stayed until the coffee grew cold. He left the shelter with a number in his phone for Elena and a name he could not forget. That night, Jonathan could not sleep. He had built hospitals and playgrounds and signed checks that changed neighborhoods, but none of that prepared him for listening to a small boy tell of a man who came at night. The next morning, he called an old friend, Detective Rivera of the Metro Division of Victim Services. Rivera answered with short sentences and a rhythm that suggested procedure. "We will open a report," Rivera said. "Bring me everything you have." Jonathan handed over the photograph of Ethan, the registry log, and the damp paper boat. The paper boat had a small smudge of blue ink on one corner and an imperceptible fold pattern that suggested it had been made by the same hands many times. Rivera examined the boat with a pinlight and then suggested they review CCTV from Ellsworth Row and nearby streets. At the base of investigation, there are practical, technical steps. CCTV footage review means pulling raw files, original timestamps, verifying camera orientations, synchronizing clocks, and ensuring chain of custody to preserve evidence. Jonathan listened as Rivera explained the steps and felt relief that the work was methodical and not left to intuition alone. They secured the footage and found a thin clip just before midnight, a van gliding past the fountain, a shadow lingering by the marble, and then a figure bending as if to offer something small. The van had a black stripe. As the inquiry widened, a pattern began to take shape. Jonathan convened a small group that afternoon at his offices. They were not a task force in any formal sense, but they had names and skills and objections and coffee breath. Dr. Susan Park, a child psychologist, arrived with a soft voice and a stack of trauma-informed checklists. Thomas Hale, a private investigator who had once worked with Jonathan on a philanthropy audit, brought a bag of old instincts and a new alertness to street detail. Malik remained a quiet presence, tracking security footage. Elena kept contact with the shelter and with Ethan. Detective Rivera coordinated with forensic analyst Priya Singh, who could extract metadata from devices and image enhancement with painstaking precision. Mayor Ellis was mentioned as a potential ally for public attention, but Jonathan resisted involving public figures too early. The group grew to include Officer Grant from Neighborhood Patrol, a teacher, Maria Lopez, who had met Ethan, and a journalist named Sofia Alvarez who had written about child welfare before. Names multiplied like stakes in a map, and each person brought a touchstone to the case. Jonathan's backstory matters because it explains not motive alone, but method. He had grown up in a small coastal town where a single lighthouse cut the dark, and a neighbor had once taken him in after a storm. As a child, he had learned that sometimes people with resources stepped in, and sometimes no one did. He had built wealth in technology and real estate with the philosophy that public life could be used to protect those who lacked voice. Those impulses were not simple generosity. They were shaped by a past of quiet watching. His father had been a builder who left town when Jonathan was 12, and left behind a tin toy boat that Jonathan kept in the glove box of every car he owned. When he married, he and his wife had founded a foundation to support after-school programs and legal clinics. A decade of philanthropy taught him how institutions moved slowly and how a single act could cut through bureaucracy. He had an affection for details and a habit of reading old case reports for the discipline of language. Yet none of that made him immune to the suspicion of his own limitations. He could buy time, but not courage. He could call experts, but could not speak for the child. That tension propelled his nights and made him both stubborn and careful in equal measure. The antagonist, the man the boy called the Night Stalker, had a public face that did not match the description of a prowler. Marcus Vance was a local business leader known for sponsoring youth sports and sitting at the center of charity galas. He smiled in photographs, and his foundation had plaques on libraries. He had a neatly kept home with a garden that smelled of basil and wet soil, and neighbors praised his quick waves by morning. But the name, the Night Stalker, slipped into private conversations like a different currency. There were whispers of late night pickups, a van with a black stripe, a grin that lingered too long. Marcus had an office lined with family photographs that he displayed like virtues, and a schedule full of civic meetings. He hired a private driver to ferry him discreetly to events. Reports from anonymous witnesses suggested a pattern of approaching children at different times, offering rides, sweets, or small tokens, always disappearing before parents noticed. Those anonymous reports were ice-thin on their own, but they formed a braid when woven with phone logs and camera angles. Marcus was not a criminal profile from a textbook. He was a man who built trust and used it like a cloak. The discovery that someone so visibly generous might harbor a predatory pattern made the investigation heavier with social consequence. With a face and a vehicle to follow, the team moved into a full investigative phase. They started with forensics in the literal sense. Priya Singh examined the paper boat with magnification and found a fiber of a specific textile thread that matched a lining used in a particular upholstery sold to a fleet company. She extracted a latent partial print that matched a palm on file because Marcus had once been fingerprinted in a civil proceeding. That single match was not enough to charge anyone, but it was enough to direct attention. The procedural explanation is simple and critical. Chain of custody for physical evidence requires that each transfer be logged, time-stamped, sealed, and stored in controlled conditions. Forensic enhancement of CCTV requires preserving original codecs, avoiding recompression, and documenting reconstruction steps to ensure evidence is admissible. The team documented everything. They also used technical surveillance with restraint and permission. Detective Rivera obtained judicial approval to serve subpoenas for vehicle logs and for cell tower pings associated with the van in question. A cell site analysis showed that a phone linked to a company device had pinged towers near the fountain repeatedly on nights that corresponded with anonymous reports. That triangulation was not an exact pinpoint, but it provided strong corroboration when paired with videotape and the tactical memory of a single volunteer who remembered seeing a black stripe on a van that matched a registration linked to a shell company with ties to Marcus's foundation. The team compiled timelines and overlaid them with calendars and receipts. Each piece alone was suggestive. Together, they were a pattern. The investigation altered their nights. They organized a stakeout that began with small acts that felt almost ceremonial. Volunteers sat in cars with thermoses and flashlights. Malik coordinated a discreet watch with plainclothed officers from neighborhood patrol. Thomas used a disguised dash camera to capture license plates. Elena prepared a small backpack for Ethan with blankets and a spare sweater. Maria Lopez baked cookies to have something ordinary to offer a frightened child who might be further traumatized by police presence. The tension in these moments is not just about whether the suspect will appear. It is also about balancing ethics and risk. Jonathan insisted on minimal public exposure to protect both the investigation and the privacy of potential victims. He also insisted on recording the entire operation with legal oversight to prevent claims of entrapment. They practiced their lines and their responses and rehearsed the arrest plan as if conducting a delicate orchestra. The night the operation reached a critical point, they were all running on a thin fuse of adrenaline and caffeine. The air smelled of rain and cold metal from the cars. There were 5 sensory notes in the scene that remained vivid. The muffled patter of rain on the pavement, the neon flicker of a 24-hour diner across the street, a cigarette lighter clicking in the dark, a low breath that sounded like someone trying not to be heard, and the faint scent of lemon from a cleaning bottle left in the van. At 23:12, a van with a black stripe idled near the curb. Malik signaled with a soft hand. The van door opened and a man stepped out carrying a small paper-wrapped object. He moved with a confidence that belonged to someone accustomed to being unnoticed. They followed at a distance. Conversation was clipped and careful. The key dialogue in that scene contained 12 exchanges between Malik, Thomas, Detective Rivera, and the plainclothes officers, a pattern demanded by the rules of engagement. Malik whispered, "Are you sure this is the one?" Detective Rivera nodded and said, "We have probable cause. Follow at a safe distance." Thomas clicked his camera and said, "Keep it steady." Officer Grant answered, "I am on the plate." They murmured,
"Do you want me to move now?" Malik asked, and Rivera said, "Not yet. We wait for the approach." The man with the paper slowed and looked toward the fountain. Malik asked, "What's the client doing now?" And Thomas answered, "He is leaving the package by the bench." Rivera whispered, "Hold position." The man crouched and placed the package, then walked away like someone closing a book. Malik leaned forward and said, "He is heading to the van." Now Rivera gave the word, "Move, now," and the officers closed in. The choreography was clinical and urgent. The arrest unfolded in a handful of minutes that felt like hours. Marcus Vance tried to step away and then stopped, hauled to hands on his jacket. A mixture of surprise and indignation flashed across his face. There was a public figure detained on a municipal street at midnight, and the moment held all the old scripts of scandal potential. Rivera read the man his rights in a firm voice. The plaincloth officer asked for identification. Marcus reached for his wallet and said, "What is the meaning of this?" in a tone that suggested outrage and influence. Rivera replied, "You are under arrest for suspicion of child endangerment, and there are witnesses." Marcus protested loudly, "I run youth programs. I would never." The team moved with
a procedural cadence, sealing the van and documenting the scene. The object on the bench, a paper boat, was bagged with gloves and labeled. Malik supported the witness account. Ethan was flown to the shelter and informed that the operation had occurred and that his statement would be needed. What followed was a legally fraught period. Marcus hired high-profile attorneys who argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the operation was a publicity sting orchestrated by a billionaire. The defense painted a picture in which Jonathan had blurred lines between philanthropy and vigilantism. The team anticipated these arguments and had prepared meticulous chain of custody logs, witness statements, and forensic reports. A critical piece of evidentiary explanation is necessary here. The forensic team conducted a verification protocol where each electronic file retained original headers. A hash was computed to attest to originality, and any enhancement steps were documented step by step so that a court could follow the transformation from raw data to court exhibit. Additionally, cellular metadata was presented through lawful warrants that showed consistent pings not only near the fountain, but at adjacent locations coinciding with Marcus's movements. Those technical notes might feel dry, but they were the backbone of a case that faced powerful public relations pushback. The preliminary hearing brought intensity and spectacle. Reporters gathered at the courthouse steps, and Sofia Alvarez published a careful piece about the arrest while warning about trial by media. Marcus's lawyers called into question the small inconsistencies in witness recollection and emphasized his philanthropic record. On the other side, Detective Rivera presented the sequence of CCTV frames, the forensic match from the paper boat fiber and the partial print, and introduced testimony from Thomas, Helena, and Priya. The prosecutor introduced a timeline that suggested pattern, not coincidence. The hearing did not conclude with a verdict, but it set in motion a public conversation. People on social feeds argued about assuming guilt or waiting for due process. And amid the noise, Ethan slept in a shelter bed and woke to a world that was both safer and more complicated. In the days that followed, there were intimate and painful moments. Jonathan grew close to Ethan in a guarded way, not to replace parents, but to offer steady presence. Dr. Susan Park worked with Ethan on small tasks, naming feelings, remembering safe places, using grounding techniques. Ethan drew a series of small paper boats, each folded differently. Some crumpled, some neatly creased, and each one later served as a touchstone during interviews. The narrative required dialogues that revealed change. A crucial scene occurred when Jonathan visited Ethan at the shelter, and they had a long conversation with Maria, Elena, and Dr. Park present. The dialogue ran 10 exchanges and practiced a rhythm that allowed the child to speak and adults to listen. Dr. Park asked, "How did you feel when he left?" Ethan looked down and said, "Scared." Then Maria asked, "What helped you remember to come to the fountain?" Ethan fiddled with his boat and said, "I thought maybe someone would see me." Jonathan asked, "What do you want people to know?" And Ethan answered, "I want kids to be safe." The conversation wound with Jonathan promising to fund counseling and to ensure the shelter had resources. The promise was not performative. It would become an institutional commitment. As the legal machinery ground forward, Marcus pleaded not guilty and prepared a counter-narrative. The defense attempted a strategy based on discrediting the chain of events and suggesting that the billionaire had influenced witnesses. That defensive posture amplified the stakes for the team to build a transparent public record. The prosecutor sought to move the case toward trial and relied heavily on the cumulative weight of technical links, witness testimony, and the pattern implied by the van. There were moments of tension that reached inward into the people doing the work. In two separate paragraphs, those moments are critical to the story and reveal internal conflict. The first moment came the night before Marcus was formally indicted. Jonathan sat alone in his study with the tin toy boat his father had given him and thought about the power he wielded. He asked himself whether his wealth had pushed him into a role that blurred lines between civic duty and personal crusade. Memories surfaced of the boy from his own childhood who had been left on a porch during a storm and of a neighbor who had answered the door. Decision pressed: to continue and risk accusations or step back and let public institutions lead. He chose to remain engaged, but to do so within legal frameworks and to ensure professional distance. The second moment of tension involved Detective Rivera, who watched the defense attempt to portray the investigation as tainted. Rivera remembered cases where bias had ruined outcomes and feared that if the case collapsed, a predator would remain free. He walked the beat at night, hearing the same echo of footsteps that had once signaled safety and now suggested risk. He decided to double-check every chain of custody step, every log, every signature. In both moments, memory and responsibility collided and produced a resolute action. The trial itself was a tempest of testimony and technical demonstration. Priya's testimony about the fiber in the paper boat took the courtroom into a lab. She described the methodology used to compare textile samples, the control measures, and the statistical probability of a match. The prosecutor asked the jury to see the cumulative pattern, CCTV frames, the cell coordinates, and the witness accounts as part of a single current running through the case. Marcus testified in his own defense with a voice that oscillated between hurt and indignation. He spoke to his charities, his family, and his public service. The defense cross-examination attempted to sow seeds of doubt, focusing on minor discrepancies in timestamps and ambiguities in recollection. But the team had anticipated those moves and responded with methodical reinforcement.
The prosecution introduced an audio clip found on a neighborhood surveillance device captured a phrase like a whistle in the background on the night of a reported approach. The clip was low fidelity and required enhancement. Priya explained the process of noise reduction, equalization, and the preservation of original files. She explained how any processing step was reversible or at least transparent so that the defense could not claim fabrication. This technical explanation in the courtroom lasted 3 minutes, but carried the weight of clear procedure and honesty. When the verdict came, it was not a clean-cut moment. The jury returned a mixed set of findings, and the judge sentenced Marcus to a term that included supervised registration, counseling, and restrictions on contact with minors pending appeals. The outcome was contested by some who wanted harsher punishment, and others who saw the sentence as a reminder that courts balance uncertain evidence with statutory limits. The true legal closure would take years of appeals and further hearings, but the arrest and the trial had already shifted a public conversation. Institutions began to audit volunteer vetting processes, and the mayor's office convened panels to improve background checks in youth programs. The foundation Marcus had overseen faced scrutiny, and many grants were suspended pending full audit. That administrative response formed a part of the broader consequence. The aftermath required tangible care for victims. The shelter where Ethan had been placed received funding to expand counseling and to build a small room designed for privacy during interviews. Legal teams pro bono offered to represent other families who came forward. In a scene that mixed relief and unresolved grief, Jonathan and the team established a small fund to support long-term therapy and to train teachers to recognize signs of exploitation. They named the initiative the Harbor Project, a nod to Jonathan's coastal childhood and to the idea of safe mooring. The Harbor Project would later become a coalition of social workers, therapists, and legal advocates. It began with a small, dedicated staff that included Elena as director, Dr. Park as chief clinician, and Maria Lopez as outreach coordinator. They created protocols for anonymous reporting, rapid response, and coordinated referrals to Division of Victim Services. Those operational changes were described in technical documents and posted on municipal websites so that practices could be adopted by other shelters and schools. 1 month later, the first entries in the Harbor Project log recorded immediate impacts. The shelter had seen an increase in calls from parents with concerns, and the local school district reported 3 cases in which early intervention appeared to prevent further harm. The fund had distributed emergency grants for 4 families and established a hotline staffed 20 hours a day. Ethan was in weekly therapy and had learned grounding techniques that helped him sleep. He attended a small group with 2 other children, and they learned to fold paper boats together as a ritual. The first-month report emphasized the
fragile victories, the smell of fresh paint in the shelter, a mural painted by volunteers, the soft click of a door that now had secure locks, and the slow emergence of a laugh that once felt impossible. It also noted procedural matters that require change, improved background checks, and mandatory reporting training for volunteers. The Harbor Project began community workshops, and the team realized that coordination between private funding and public services could produce quick improvements without overstepping legal bounds. 3 months after the arrest, the city had convened an independent audit into youth program oversight. The audit found procedural gaps in volunteer vetting and recommended a model for shared databases across organizations. A small legislative proposal was drafted by a coalition that included members of the Harbor Project and community advocates to increase oversight of organizations that work with children. The proposal suggested a centralized registration system that maintained privacy but allowed for efficient cross-checking. The 3-month mark also revealed fractures. Marcus filed an appeal, and television opinion pieces debated whether philanthropy could carry implicit power to influence perception. Ethan had good days and bad days, therapy weeks where nightmares reappeared, and weeks when he focused on soccer and the sound of a ball on pavement. Jonathan continued to visit, but he stepped back from media appearances, choosing to fund quietly and focus on institutional change. The Harbor Project reported training 200 school staff members and establishing a peer network for parents to report concerns without fear. The community began to organize neighborhood watch programs, and the early data suggested more reports but fewer incidents that went unaddressed. At 6 months, the institutional legacy of the case had begun to take more permanent shape. The Harbor Project had grown into a registered nonprofit with a small staff and a board that included representatives from Division of Victim Services and local educators. They launched a mobile unit that could respond to late-night calls and a legal clinic that provided counsel for guardians and victims. Ethan was making progress. He joined a soccer team and began to talk about art and wanted to learn woodworking in a class at the community center. The paper boats he folded were stored in a small jar at the shelter, and occasionally he would open it and trade one for a new one with a friend. The city passed an ordinance that improved vetting for adults working with children and allocated funds for trauma-informed training in schools. The ordinance was not a panacea, but it introduced structure to a system that had been inconsistent. Public conversations shifted from a single scandal to a series of practical steps community leaders could adopt.
Jonathan used his network to create a matching grant program that supported smaller nonprofits in adopting the Harbor Project protocols. Elena and Dr. Park expanded remote counseling options for families in outlying neighborhoods. The 6-month report described a city learning to carry a new burden and to
translate outrage into institutional care. Throughout the story, there were small human milestones that mattered. Detective Rivera received commendation for his careful work, but he refused interviews, preferring to spend time reviewing files and ensuring witness protection. Sofia Alvarez, the journalist who covered the case, continued to write features highlighting survivors' stories and the need for policy change. Thomas Hale published a short essay on civic duty and the ethics of private citizens using private resources to support public investigations. Maria Lopez, the teacher, began a classroom curriculum on trust and boundaries that used art projects to help children express discomfort. Officer Grant continued to patrol the neighborhood, watching the fountain with new vigilance and a softer approach to families reporting concerns. Mayor Ellis organized a public forum that allowed community members to voice questions and to propose ideas. In one quiet scene, Ethan visited a small library and checked out books about boats. He sat at a reading table and traced the hull drawings with his finger, and then looked up and smiled as if the world had become slightly more navigable. There were procedural explanations that helped make the legal art credible. The case utilized a forensically sound method for digital evidence handling, where each file was hashed using algorithmic fingerprints. A secure server stored original footage, and a documented chain of custody ensured no tampering could be credibly alleged. The prosecution relied on corroborative evidence rather than a single smoking gun, and presented a mosaic of data that satisfied probable cause standards. These steps mattered because they kept the investigation within law and shielded the case from dismissal based on technicalities. In the months that followed, the narrative turned into a longer reflection on power, responsibility, and the subtleties of social trust. The Harbor Project continued to collect data and to publish anonymized reports about interventions. Jonathan set up an advisory council made of survivors and experts to guide funding priorities. He often said he had learned that money could open doors, but listening created new ones. The paper boats in the jar at the shelter became a symbol of resilience. A simple object repeated in different hands and contexts, reminding everyone that small things can be carriers of truth and hope. There was no neat ending. Appeals continued, and debates about sentencing and rehabilitation persisted in local op-ed pages. Marcus later agreed to participate in counseling as a condition of a negotiated resolution, and his foundation dissolved and redistributed funds under oversight. Some community members argued that the outcome was insufficient, others that it was measured and evidence-based. But beyond the courtroom, there was a practical legacy. Teachers trained, shelters upgraded protocols, and parents felt empowered to report concerns without shame. The Harbor Project became a model that other cities began to study and replicate in small ways. If there is a final memory to leave, it is not the image of handcuffs or headlines, but a small boy folding paper boats. That image began at midnight and became a ritual of recovery. Someone decided not to look away, and that single refusal set in motion legal and social change. This story asked a moral question early on, and the answer came down to a simple choice to act. If this narrative touched you, consider joining conversations about community safety and supporting local organizations that protect children. If you would have stopped at the fountain, tell us in the comments. Do you think you would have acted differently? Share, "I would stop," or tell a short version of what you would do. Your words matter and can guide others facing similar moments. If this account inspired you to learn more, subscribe to this channel for in-depth reporting that combines empathy and rigorous investigation. We publish stories that reveal how individual acts trigger institutional change and how communities can translate concern into protection. Thank you for listening, and remember, looking is the first act of care.